Lack of draftees is not only an HBCU problem, but an overall FCS problem. And an FCS expert, Bluebloods, joins to talk about how do we fix it. Oh yeah, it's Locked on HBCU. Play my music.
Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked on HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor. Thank you for going on this journey with me, making Locked on HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. You can see it right there at the bottom of the screen. But if you don't, that just means it's time. That just means you're on the audio side of things. And don't forget the S on the end of South Exclusives. My guy Bluebloods joins the show to talk about the overall issue of FCS players not being drafted in the NFL draft. We start off talking about what's the problem, how do you fix it, and we get all the way into the transferring players. There's so many things to unpack in this conversation, and we try to do our best to do it within 30 minutes.
Okay, Blue, one of the things that I consistently preach on this show is that this is not just an HBCU problem when it comes to the NFL draft. This is an FCS problem. And I know that we talk about HBCUs because this is Locked on HBCU, but you cover all of the FCS schools. So what are you seeing amongst this whole subdivision?
I would say it's a lack of respect just kind of put on the whole subdivision. I think you even see it at the you can extend it to the group of 5 level, in my opinion. I think when you look at the draft picks, if you just combine the SEC and the Big Ten, you're probably accounting for well over 50% of the picks year in and year out. And so I know everyone says there's 259 picks and there's this many universities. Really and truly, if you're an FCS HBCU program, you're really only competing for about 20 picks.
Yeah.
That's really what you're competing for, to be honest with you. And so when you look back, I think only 41 selections over the past 4 years, which is about 1,200 selections, have been from FCS programs. That's
41 over the.
Yeah, 41 since I think the 2020 draft. So you got the 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. Only 41 FCS selections, and 18 of those are from the Missouri Valley, and 6 are from the Big Sky, 5 are from the CAA. So that accounts for about 70% of those right there.
That's crazy to me. That's crazy to me when you look at just first off, that's 2020, 4 drafts. That's an average of 10 apiece. I don't know if people really realize how insane that is. We're over here talking about 5, 6 HBCU players that we're talking about being drafted. That's ridiculous, and I guess when you hear stats like this is one of the things that's interesting to me is I feel like when I hear this 40 players drafted from FCS schools over the last 4 seasons, maybe I should adjust my expectations. Maybe I shouldn't be so frustrated. Maybe, I don't know. I get a little lost because now I have new information that kind of bucks at what I previously thought I should do. And I don't know. How do you take it being an FCS guy and looking at everything? Do you get your expectations up or do you just be like, this is what it is?
I'll be honest, this year, so my range coming into the draft, I had 3 was the low for HBCU guys. 6 was the high for me.
Me too.
And 6 is if everything went perfectly. And you got some guys who did amazing and had perfect fits. For FCS, I was sitting around the 18 to 22 mark. And you got 11.
Yeah.
So it was a low, because last year you had 24 guys get drafted from the FCS, which was a huge increase because in 2020, 2021, you had 6 apiece in those drafts. Just 6. So it seems like that 24 was more of an outlier more than a rule. So I think everyone has to decrease their expectations to a point, because at the end of the day, like we just said, you're really only fighting for a handful of picks. You have what, 125 FCS programs, 130 plus FBS. You have the D2 schools, you have the NAIA schools, you got the D3 schools. There's so many schools fighting for a less than 300 spots. And then on top of that, too, you have the question marks about competition. You have the question marks about fit. You have the bad performances. Like, you could go the list of stuff. And I think an interesting point that KJ Black, who used to coach at FAMU, now he's at the Rams, an interesting point that he said is a lot of these FCS guys might be undersized. You look at the Isaiah Lands, you look at some of these other guys, but a lot of FCS programs, especially HBCUs and some of the other lower FCS programs, they can't afford a nutritionist. If Isaiah Lamb was at Georgia, as soon as he walked in the door, they would have a they would have a meal plan, they would have all workout plan, everything would be regimented where he could put on 25 pounds of muscle by the next season. FAMU doesn't have that. They don't have access to funds like that. They aren't getting they don't have the resources for that. So that's what you're fighting as well. Is it's a resource battle at the end of the day. And something I talked about last night on my show is it's a connection battle. And I'm not saying that no one in FCS has NFL connections, but it seems like they're being underutilized or undervalued, because if you think you go to a P5 program, if any of the coaches on the staff have connections in terms of scouts, GMs, people in NFL franchises in those buildings, if you don't think they're calling in favors, making sure their players are on the board, make sure their players are being scouted, you are mistaken. So how often does that happen at the FCS to HBCU level? The argument is not happening enough, apparently, because I talked to an agent, man. I'll give you a little thing. I talked to two or three agents at the pro day down in Jackson. They said if your player's not on the board by junior year, he's not getting drafted.
That sounds like high school. That's how it used to be in high school. If you're not getting serious consideration by the time you're a junior, you might want to be looking at some different routes. That I did not know that was a way of thought that extended into college too. But I think an appropriate transition is a lot of those players who were told to look at different avenues ended up at HBCUs. And this is something I spoke about on my show yesterday. It's the idea that you need better recruiting coming out of high school. And it's easier said than done. But I believe that as long as we continue having mostly 3-star and under players who might be looked at as having low ceilings by the NFL when they come out of high school, that same low ceiling label is going to be attached to them coming out of college. And they won't get the chance. They won't get that flyer. They won't get the opportunity to be a 6th-round pick. Meanwhile, the 5-star out of Tennessee, Tennessee was good this year. The 5-star out of Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt sucks at football. What are they doing? But that guy was a 5-star, and they think that I can get the best out of him. I think that's a significant issue for me.
Yeah, I mean, and then also you also have the perception. Like, I got into, I kind of argue with some people because there was this strong push for Shaq Davis and Jadakiss Bonds, 2 prospects I love to get drafted. When the kid from Princeton went, Andre Isovas, everyone was tweeting out, Princeton? Really? A player from Princeton? And I'm like, how are you going to have that opinion and you ain't watched a lick of film of this kid? This is a kid who's a 3-time Ivy League selection, 6'3", 205, broke the 60-meter NCAA record in the track and field, went to the Senior Bowl, and had the stats and athleticism to prove it, but now you're mad because your favorite player didn't get drafted. I think that's a big thing too, is everyone lives in their own bubble. Unless you are scouting outside of your favorite conference, it's hard for you to have an opinion on who and who shouldn't be drafted because you have no data points to base it to. That's the biggest thing for me is when you cover the whole FCS, I can tell you how a guy in the MEAC compares to a guy in the Big Sky, etc. G from Draft HBCU, he can tell you how these players compare across the HBCU diaspora. But if you're only watching your favorite team week in and week out, you really don't have any basis to tell anybody that this is where your prospect or your favorite player should have been because you have nothing to compare it to.
No, you're right. And this is something that they're gonna hate me, but I referenced Bomani Jones again because I thought he had a phenomenal thread on Twitter talking about the lack of HBCU players being drafted. And one of the things he said is a lot of people clamor similar to award shows where how did Bluebloods not win show of the year? How did Locked On HBCU not win show of the year? but you really didn't watch any of the other shows. You have absolutely no idea what else is out there. People like, oh, Kendrick didn't win album of the year. How you give it to this guy? We never heard. How you even gonna say this guy didn't deserve it? You didn't hear his album. You didn't watch his show. You didn't watch his tape. But at the same time, it's like I don't really care from a fan perspective, right? I don't really care. At the end of the day, I love Shaq Davis. Shout out to Shaq Davis going to the Saints, by the way. But Shaq Davis, I like Shaq Davis. I like this. I like that. And it's just isolated to that player. And I think this is something that I want to dive deeper into as we continue with Locked on HBCU. Before we get into that, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. And listen, I think we're going to have the Warriors game coming on Tuesday night, I believe. And if it isn't, game one will be soon. Just go ahead and put some money down on it. You have Bron versus Curry. You have Durant versus Jokic. You have so many great series. I'm specifically looking in the West. But meanwhile, you have the Heat versus the Knicks, which was a really good game one. And they did what they needed to do to get that win in New York. I think this is a great NBA playoffs thus far. And the only thing that can make it better is if you go ahead and put some money and win at FanDuel.com/locked-on. But if you don't win, first bet, no sweat, guarantees you to get up to $1,000 back in free bets. It's extremely simple. Put your money down. If you lose, you get money back to try again. It's a win-win. Just go to FanDuel.com/locked-on today to make every moment more. And as we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked on HBCU, I appreciate you for making us your first listen of the day every day. On tomorrow's episode, we'll be discussing why Faison Wilson leaving Grambling is not only an L for Grambling, it's an L for all HBCUs. But right now, I have my guy Blue of Bluebloods coming on. I really do appreciate you, my guy. You said something that was interesting. How do these conferences kind of compare? Because FCS schools as a whole don't get respect. And I'd argue that HBCU conferences get even less respect. So how are we comparing these schools versus, I guess, the PWIs and the FCS landscape?
I think there's a strong argument that unless you reside in Fargo, North Dakota, you're probably not feeling great about your chances to develop players for the NFL draft. Because you could say only one North Dakota State player got drafted this year. I got you. But they've had 5 straight now, all in like the first 2 rounds, including 2 top 5 picks. And it's a different level up there. But when you go outside of that, it's really just kind of hit or miss. Like the Ivy League has had 2 straight players drafted as well. So like you kind of get like a hit or miss type thing. But I talked about this last night. Players have to be more strategic in where they go. You know this, like me and you both played. Anyone who's played sports understands this. If I'm looking for a program, if I play offensive line or whatever position you want to give either one of us, we're not going to a school that doesn't produce that position well.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if me and you are both wide receivers, why are we going to an offense that has never had a 1,000-yard receiver that isn't putting wide receivers in the draft? That goes back to coaching connections and development. That's my biggest thing is like when I look at offensive line development, probably go to the Missouri Valley Conference. They're putting out offensive linemen like crazy. If you're an edge rusher, outside of this year, the SWAC has had pretty good history of putting out some defensive edge rushers, and they have had some of the best across the FCS. Probably a safe bet, but I just feel like it's so hit or miss with some of these prospects. Like, let's connect it back to high school. Like you said, these guys who are saying if you're not on the board by junior year, you might as well go ahead and take whatever options out there. That doesn't mean to stop doing your research and just take whatever you have. Is saying, okay, maybe I need to shift my focus from these specific universities to, okay, here's what I have. Which one out of the pool of options that I have is the best for me?
Yes.
Because if these players make those right decisions, it helps those other universities make those decisions. Because if you're not developing talent, you probably shouldn't be coaching at the collegiate level. That's the big thing. So it will all kind of work itself out. But in terms of the whole FCS, man, it's just, to me, the biggest thing KJ Black said that it still bothers me today, man. I went on a whole rant last night, man. You kind of heard me. The fact that when Isaiah Bolden was drafted, there was a person, multiple people within the Rams organization that never heard his name. Put that in perspective for people. The one HBCU guy that got drafted was never even mentioned by the Rams organization, where Isaiah Bolden played a postseason All-Star game in the state that the Rams are located in. If that is not the prime example of scout laziness, I don't know what is. I mean, doesn't even make logical sense to me. And it's not just Isaiah Bolden. I guarantee that there were some scouts that didn't know all 11 FCS prospects. I guarantee it.
It's that's kind of bad. Like that's back in the NFLPA Bowl. It's not like he was in some rinky bowl. He's one of the 3 premier draft bowls. So for me, I look at Isaiah Bolden, Isaiah Land, Xavier Smith, all of these players, and I try to say, what can we do? What can we do to force the issue? I don't know if there's anything you can do to force the issue to something of that degree. If we're getting to the point where you don't even know a player who was in the NFLPA Bowl, what can I do for you? I don't think there's anything I can.
Yeah, I'm with you because I feel like like my whole show last night was based on everyone's trying to come up with like this checklist where it's if you check off each one of these things, it guarantees you a shot to the NFL. When in reality, when you talk to scouts, when you talk to agents, when you talk to these people that are really connected, there's not a checklist that doesn't exist. It's impossible to come up with one which yields 100% guaranteed results unless you're at the P5 level and you win the Heisman. That's about all you could do. That's it. Like that's the one guarantee. That's the one box you could check. But the FCS level, there's not a checklist. Like when you start looking at players who are drafted, I came up with some things that people always mention: impressive performances against P5 competition. Jacoby Durant, Titus Howard are the first 2 names that come to mind to me. Jacoby Durant with his 2 picks against Clemson. Titus Howard had a dominant performance against Auburn, which had multiple NFL defensive linemen on that team. But how many guys from FCS HBCU have done that exact same thing and haven't got drafted? That's not 100%. You got elite special teams ability. Isaiah Bolden, Montrell Washington from Stanford last year. That got him drafted, but that's not a guaranteed 100%. You have on-field performance accolades: Cody Mauch, Trevor Penning, 2 first and second round picks from the MVFC. That doesn't always work because Isaiah Land would have been drafted as the Buck Buchanan Award winner. Is it measurables, elite athleticism? Andre Asovas, Marte Mapu from this year. That doesn't always matter. There were some really elite athletic freaks that came from FCS HBCU that weren't drafted. Then you got postseason all-star games. Cole Strange, Christian Watson from last year at the Senior Bowl kind of come to mind. But Aubrey Miller, McClendon Curtis, and Isaiah Land all did that. They weren't drafted. So there's not like a checklist. I think you have to have a combination of the few. Like it has to be just a perfect mix. But I think people are wasting their time saying, what do we have to do rather than just looking at the totality and being like, man, this is a case by case basis. There's not something you can put out in the atmosphere that guarantees players from your school, your division, your conference are getting drafted, man. It is a case by case basis per individual player.
Yeah. I think the one thing I felt, and this is the one thing I think is a guarantee, and this is you might not agree. I would love to know, is being able to bring in 4-star, 5-star recruits. And that's the epitome of easier said than done. Because to me, it's about breaking a cycle. If you start bringing in a bunch of 5-star recruits, and it has to be all the way down, It can't be one school. Because if it's one school within a conference, they're just playing a bunch of players who aren't impressive to other people, and then it devalues the 5-stars performance. But if you recruit a bunch of players, it's like, oh, now you actually have competitive, high-level play, and now people respect your conference. But I think that's the epitome of easier said than done. I would love to know your opinion on that format.
Yes, technically it would. Are there busts that in terms of recruiting rankings? Yeah. But I think this is a little bit overblown. I'm gonna lay it out for you, in terms of statistics. The recruiting rankings out of high school aren't necessarily always based on high school performance, high school accolades. Those like top 300 rankings for On 3, 247, Rivals, ESPN, they're supposed to reflect in 4 years who are your top 300 prospects in the NFL draft. That's what it's actually supposed to project. It's not just a ranking of how they performed in high school. These guys, if you go back, go look at any of the high level guys at On 3's Twitter this weekend. All it was comparing draft rankings to what they were as a recruit. And if you look at it, is actually really damn accurate. Like to a point. I mean, it's very like I know everyone says there's way more three stars, 2 stars, 1 stars playing in the NFL than 5 stars. Well, no kidding, because every year there's only 35 stars. So there better be more three stars and unranked guys who got overlooked because there's thousands more of them than the 35 stars we get once a year. So
Yeah.
of course that's always going to be the case. But when you look at the recruiting rankings, they are fairly I'll say fairly accurate. I think they're somewhere in the like 70 percentile or something like that in terms of accuracy projecting. When you go look at the first round, there's a whole lot of 5 and 4 stars in there.
About breaking this cycle, because I do believe it's a cycle. You don't create or you don't develop this kind of player, so I'm not going to go there. And they just continue to not develop that player. I want to dive into that trend, but I'm also going to ask a big time question as we wrap up today's episode of Locked on HBCU. And as we wrap up Locked on HBCU, making us your first listen of the day, every day, making it all day, taking it 3 minutes. I really appreciate that, and thank you time for it. A very broad question, bring a cycle. How do you convince players to go to FCS HBCU out of high school when they see things like this?
Good Lord, man.
I know it.
You could just I mean, you could just ask me what the lottery numbers are going to be next week. Like man, it's getting harder and harder to like make that argument. It really is. And I'm a huge FCS advocate. I hate when players transfer out, but at this point, like it's hard to say they're not doing what's best for them because I see the numbers. Like I get that there's a lot of people fighting this narrative, and I agree with the narrative to a point that going to a big school doesn't necessarily guarantee you a draft spot. You're right. But the way I had a parent of a player who ended up transferring from an FCS program explain it to me is if you walk into a casino and you got one machine on your left only giving out money about 5% of the time, and you got the next machine that's putting out money about 50, 60% of the time, which one are you going to go play?
And I completely understand the analogy that you made. It's about playing the numbers. You're going to go to the one that's both hit, but which one hits more often? Which one is going to produce more NFL athletes? And that's why you see players like Bashul Tootin transfer out. That's why you see a guy like Tank Dell, who got drafted this weekend. He transferred out of Alabama A&M. And I understand everybody wants to create a change. I get it. But I also understand everybody's not meant to fight. Not everybody is here to fight the cause. Some people are like, you know what? I don't want to take the harder route if I don't have to. I want to get to the NFL. I love my HBCU. But I also understand that sometimes they don't put me in the best position to make it to the league. And I just personally feel like we need to handle that with a little bit more empathy, a little bit more understanding when players decide to do that.
It comes back to this, man. I talked a little bit about this last night. Is that everyone had a dream, man, and these guys are pursuing like a major dream of theirs, and so you can't be mad at them for making the decision that they thought was best for them. Like I just want to put it in perspective. 2 of the last 3 Jerry Rice Award winners have now transferred to FBS. In 2022, 68 FCS players with on the field honors, which is all conference, all freshmen, all American, whatever you want to call it, all transferred to FBS. None of the last 3 Walter Payton Award winners have been drafted. The last one to be drafted was Trey Lance. Put that in perspective. Trey Lance was the last guy who won the FCS Heisman to hear his name called. The last 5 or 6 Buck Buchanan Award winners have now not been drafted. So you're looking at these guys saying, what do I have to do to get drafted? You see guys, well, let's be honest, you, everyone listening to the show all saw it. There were guys getting drafted with like 3.5 career sacks. I mean, 0 production, and they're getting drafted, and you got guys like Isaiah Land and Aubrey Miller and all these guys sitting there waiting for their opportunity. And I use this guy as an example all the time to make my point. I'm going to read a quick stat line. And anyone who tells me if this guy didn't play it at a Power 5 or FBS program, he wouldn't have went top 5 into the draft is crazy. And this guy was not a first round pick. He finished with 428 career receptions for almost 7,000 yards, 73 touchdowns, averaged over 100 yards per game for his entire career, 120, a two-time FCS Offensive Player of the Year, won the Walter Payton, won the Jerry Rice Award for the top freshman, and was a 4-time consensus and unanimous FCS All-American and a 3-time FCS Academic All-American, and the guy did not even go first round.
That Kupp, is that Cooper Kupp?
Cooper Kupp.
Cooper Kupp's a dog.
And he had the measurables because I had someone on the stream last night say, well, he was undersized. That kid was 6'2", almost 200 pounds coming out of college, and he still didn't get the looks.
I hate how dismal this sounds, but it's real. You know, I think that one thing the NFL draft did for me is stripped away my optimism. We are operating with pure, unfiltered realism. And I think it's healthy that we talk about these things because every conversation doesn't have to be happy. It doesn't have to be a positive. Some of these conversations are negative, but they need to happen. And when you outline what Cooper Kupp did on an FCS level and how prolific he was and still wasn't able to get that first round selection, it's like, whoa. And we know what Cooper Kupp became. We know what he was able to translate to. Everybody doesn't have to be Cooper Kupp. And also, phenomenal point. I don't know who you were talking to, man, but phenomenal point when talking about how Cooper Kupp and Steve McNair are outliers and they shouldn't be lumped in with everybody else. That's not really a talking point for here, but I just wanted to say that was a phenomenal point that you made on the show.
Yeah.
So, okay, this is the thing I'll wrap up with. You have FBS transfers down to the FCS, and you have high school players who just enrolled in the FCS. Let's take a 4-star transfer versus a 4-star high school player. Who do you think is the more valuable prospect for an FCS or an HBCU school?
I'll take the middle road here. I was going to go somewhere. I'll take the middle road here. It depends on what your goal is.
Drafting.
Drafting?
Drafted. Yeah, I took that middle road away.
So drafting, I would probably say, depending on where they come, like if it's a 4-star transfer from like a P5 program, and he's like a James Houston where he already has film, that's the more valuable guy who's going to get drafted. You look at the last 2 Jackson State guys, both came from P5s.
With film.
Yeah, with film. But and that it's weird because that's kind of only the rule for the SWAC right now. When you look at other programs in the FCS, look at all the guys who got drafted. They were all homegrown guys coming in. When you look at the playoffs, let's take the semifinals. Outside of Incarnate Word with Lindsey Scott, all those programs were built from the bottom up. Ty Okada for Montana State, an All-American safety, walk-on, who developed into a starter for them. Isaiah Afonso, no-star recruit, is the all-time leading rusher now. Tommy Millott, homegrown, started as a true freshman 2 years ago. All those guys, they have very few transfers that come in and make significant impacts. The biggest transfer for South Dakota State when they won the national title was an NAIA transfer at linebacker in Freeman. That was their biggest transfer. Everyone else were recruits. So it depends on what the goal is. For drafting, get that FBS guy with 4 stars. But I would argue when you look at the success overall in the FCS, it's so much better to develop the talent at home. At the end of the day, man, making sure you're developing talent, that's the best way to convince other great high school kids to come. If you have no proof of concept in taking a guy who was under-recruited in high school and developing him into a superstar, what are you selling to the next guy that come in the door? Because you can't sell them the same pitch you're given to a grad transfer or a transfer from a P5 program. That's not the same pitch in terms of recruiting conversations to have. Who's the guy you can point to right now across, when you look at FAMU, they can point to Xavier Smith. They can point to Isaiah Lant. Like, they have guys to point to, but if you build your whole roster from the transfer portal, who are you pointing to for the future and guys that we developed? because you can't you cannot take credit for a guy playing 3 years elsewhere and say I developed him and only had him for a year.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. That's a great point. I will close it out on that, man. I appreciate you coming on. I love that distinction. Please tell him where to find you, please, because he's giving great insight like this on a daily basis too.
Hey, man, I appreciate you. Our website, thebluebloodscfp.com, has still got a running tracker of all like 130 FCS guys who have signed undrafted free agent contracts, mini camp invites. You can find the FCS front page there every day, the top 5 FCS stories from across the nation, the Blue Bloods on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. The bluebloodscfp.com is the website. I don't remember if I dropped that. And then the Blue Bloods on all social media, man. I appreciate you having me, man. I always love hopping on this show.
Yeah, man, we got to do it some more. Please go check it out, because don't be the person who says, how did they draft this Princeton receiver? Well, if you check out Blue Bloods, you'll know exactly why this Princeton receiver was drafted, and it's not a shot at any HBCUs. But once again, thank you. And also thank you out there, because I appreciate you for making us your first listen of the day. Every day. On tomorrow's episode, we're going to be discussing Fajon Wilson transferring from Grambling. Yeah, it hurts the Tigers. It's a big-time L for all HBCUs. In the meantime, in between time, if you're looking for me, you can find me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.